Hello, AP Psychology students. Today I am going to be talking about the causes of schizophrenia as well as the treatments for schizophrenia. So this is part 2 on schizophrenia. Um, One of the questions is there a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia? And by looking at a chart like this, we can see that the closer that someone is related to someone who has schizophrenia, then the more likely it is that they will have schizophrenia. So right here, if you have an identical twin that has schizophrenia, then in 48% of those cases, the other twin will have schizophrenia. What's interesting to note here is that fraternal twins and siblings, they're still just first degree relatives, 50% related, but fraternal twins and siblings have different rates of schizophrenia. And this would mean that there's something potentially in the prenatal environment of the fraternal twins that could potentially be a cause of schizophrenia. As you see here, the general population, the rate of schizophrenia is 1%. And then the more closely you are related to someone with schizophrenia, your likelihood of having schizophrenia yourself goes up. So your relationship to a person with schizophrenia, I am the niece of someone who had schizophrenia. He has passed away, but that put my risk factor up to about 4%. So there has not been a single gene identified, so therefore we call it multiple genes of small effect. Another interesting finding with people with schizophrenia is the brain structure and function. So first of all, it is believed that people with schizophrenia have about 6 times the number of dopamine receptor sites. And now these develop in the final stage of brain development in young adulthood. And the way that we know this is when we give someone a dopamine antagonist, then these symptoms are ameliorated. The other thing that's notable, if you look here, our brains have ventricles. These are fluid-filled spaces. We all have them, but it appears that people with schizophrenia will have larger ventricles. So that means that the brain tissues surrounding those large fluid-filled ventricles are actually pushing up against the brain tissue and perhaps causing some of the problems that we see with schizophrenia. They also have a deformed and smaller thalamus, so it's sort of like the shape of a peanut, and it is smaller than a normal thalamus is. And this, being that it is the relay station for all of the senses, this might explain some of the hallucinations or delusions that somebody might have. The one really interesting finding is decreased activity in the frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe, as you might recall, is sort of the seat of our decision making and our personality, but it's also our filter. So we can filter out irrational thoughts or, uh, you know, things that just don't make sense. But with someone with schizophrenia, they don't have as much activity in the frontal lobe. So the question is, why is their brain structure and function different? Still so much research being done in this area. Another finding that has been linked to schizophrenia is a prenatal virus. Now, this link was discovered through a study of thousands of people, and they looked at if they had a influenza type virus especially, or even rubella or chickenpox during pregnancy, and the risk of their child later on developing schizophrenia was increased by double or triple. So, is there something that happens during pregnancy that could affect the fetus long term? And this is why for me, when I had my oldest child, they did not recommend an influenza vaccine, but when I had my youngest child 8 years later, they did recommend an influenza vaccine. Marijuana use has definitely been connected with the increasing rates of psychosis and schizophrenia. And you can just see the link here. after legalization, marijuana-related ER visits climb at a Colorado hospital. The risk of developing schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder with heavy marijuana use is well known by counselors, by doctors, by people who study schizophrenia. And my caution to you as marijuana becomes more legal and accessible is that if you ever start experiencing paranoia, you have used marijuana and you experience paranoia, just stop. It's not worth it. So if you look at this chart here, early causes, if you had an obstetric complication, for example, low birth weight or prematurity, or there is a family uh, connection to schizophrenia, that leads to vulnerability. Then you abuse these dopamine agonist drugs, and if you add social stress and isolation to that, then you might develop psychosis, which is a form of severe mental illness that um, is oftentimes manifested in schizophrenia. So again, I think there's a cautionary tale here for marijuana use, especially as it becomes more accessible. The diathesis stress model suggests the predisposition to schizophrenia. I talked about this before, but basically you have genetic factors and prenatal and perinatal events. So these would be, like I said, in the family, and then things that happen during pregnancy or at delivery, such as loss of oxygen at delivery, low birth weight. This is going to lead to brain vulnerability. You add some stressors, some significant stressors, and then the natural developmental maturation process of the brain, and that leads towards a tendency towards psychosis. So not everyone who has people in their family or prenatal and perinatal events gets schizophrenia, but there is a predisposition that some people have. So how do we treat it? A treatment for schizophrenia absolutely was just transformed by the discovery of antipsychotic drugs in the 1950s. These are also known as neuroleptics. The two names I would remember are chlorpromazine and thorazine. These drugs block dopamine, and so they are dopamine antagonists. And since it's believed that dopamine is one of the culprits in schizophrenia, this is really looked to as just a great, great promising treatment for people with schizophrenia. And there are even newer drugs. Some are injectable, some target particular parts of the brain affected by schizophrenia. So the development of schizophrenia drugs has improved over the years. However, there are some really pretty significant side effects for people who take antipsychotic drugs. Some might develop tremors. Now, if you're an artist or you do something with your hands, a musician or something like that, and you have these really horrible side effects of tremors that affect, what you love to do, this often becomes something that might cause someone with schizophrenia to go off of the medication because the side effects are really quite, can be quite pronounced. The one that is especially difficult for people to handle is tardive dyskinesia. Now, if you see this word on an exam, and you're like, what the heck is tardive dyskinesia? And this happened to my students, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And so I asked them, well, think about the words. Think about the words. Tardive. Tardive kind of sounds like tardy or slow. Kinesia has to do with movement. Dys usually means malfunction of movement or not good movement. So slowed um, dysfunctional movement, basically, is what happens. So this could take the form of a stooped posture, of the inability to move quickly, and it is an unpleasant side effect. If someone is experiencing tardive dyskinesia, they probably need some medication adjustment. And keep in mind, drugs manage the symptoms, they do not cure the disease. In fact, there is no cure at this point in time. There are some people who do extremely well on antipsychotic drugs and with support, but there are some people that really, really struggle. So, prognosis, early treatment is key. If somebody starts to experience some mild paranoia or delusions of grandeur, and they get into a physician, a psychiatrist, early on in the progression of the illness, it is possible that they might go into remission or have a very mild case of schizophrenia that's effectively treated with medication, and they can live on their own and they can be, completely self-sufficient. 40%, that's a pretty big piece of the pie there, but mild to moderate symptoms, they respond well to medications. This is actually a pretty big range. In the mild side, you might notice some fleeting paranoia or grandeur or other delusions. On the moderate side, it's going to be a little bit more pronounced and noticeable by other people. 25% will have severe and chronic symptoms. They'll have some response to medications, but certainly not in a way that they can care for themselves and live on their own. And so this was the case with my uncle. He needed to be in a facility. We did see him all the time. He came home almost every weekend, but he definitely needed care and needed to be in a place where people would care for him. And then 10 to 15% actually do commit suicide. And that's one of the tragedies of this disorder. And one of the things that I just hoped in my lifetime that we would see these statistics change. But, some things have gotten better, but, like I said, there is no cure. And certainly hope to see that in my lifetime. So schizophrenia is a very serious disorder, and again, one that responds well to early treatment. So that's definitely something that I would recommend you to keep in mind if you or a loved one starts experiencing some of these symptoms that I've talked about in the first part of the screencast. All right, I am going to skip this slide and just talk briefly about something called factitious disorder. Some of you might recognize who this is. Her name is Gypsy Rose. Um, and I'll explain her story in a minute. So there's a factitious disorder imposed on yourself. This is where you intentionally make yourself sick by ingesting poison or injecting yourself with something that will actually make yourself sick. Sometimes you just falsify the symptoms and you say, oh, I've got a backache or my arm aches or something like that. But sometimes you actually do, the person who has this actually does um, induce an injury or symptom of some kind of illness on themselves. But what some people have maybe heard of is factitious disorder imposed on another, in other words, called by proxy. These used to be called Munchausen by proxy, and this is falsification of symptoms of illness imposed on another. And or intentional imposition of illness on another. So in the case of Gypsy Rose, right here, this is her mother. And you can look up on YouTube if you want to find out more about Gypsy Rose. A lot of people have heard about her. Her mom falsified many symptoms, or in some cases, even made her sick. And she had numerous diagnoses from leukemia to gosh, I don't even know what, just so many things. And like she was paralyzed, according to her mother, and her mother didn't let her walk except when she was in the house. Um, and her mom got a house through Habitat for Humanity. They went on a trip with Make a Wish Foundation. And when Gypsy Rose was 16, she met this boy that she called her boyfriend and ended up creating a plot to murder her mother, which her and her boyfriend did end up doing. She is getting released from prison soon. She was horrifically abused by her mother, and this is just a really, really sad disorder that physicians will sometimes find themselves facing, especially pediatricians with a parent who is doing this to their daughter, but it's very difficult to prove. There have been cases of parents who have put fecal matter into IVs. They've been caught on recordings that hospitals are suspicious that the parent is making their child sick. It's really quite difficult to understand why someone would do this, except it's believed that the parent who does this to their child is they enjoy the attention that they get from their child being sick. So clearly this is maladaptive. Clearly it's unjustifiable, disturbing, and atypical. Okay, so this is the end of part 2, and have a great day. Thanks for listening.